20 years later, I arrived at my sister's home, the one I'd given her, only to see her huddled asleep on the welcome mat by the front door. She was dressed in old gray rags, and my son was wiping the mud off his boots on her back, telling his guests, "That's just our crazy maid." I didn't scream. I took a step forward, and everyone froze. But before we unlock the secrets of this old Southern house and find out what happened inside, I want to ask you a small favor. Settle in and listen close. This is the story of how Clementine Brooks came back from the dead. The cab driver, a young man with tired eyes, squinted at me in the rearview mirror. "Sure, this is the place, Grandma?" he asked, slowing the car by the tall wrought iron gates. "It looks like money, and you sure they're expecting you?" I wasn't offended. I wore a simple gray coat I'd bought from a thrift store before leaving, and my worn-out boots had seen the Alaskan permafrost far more often than Georgia asphalt. That was 20 years in the North. 20 years I'd carved out of my own life so that my family, here in the soft climate of the South, would want for nothing. My face was weathered, my skin tough as parchment, and my hair was solid silver. Not a single dark strand left. To this young man, I was just an old lady who'd probably confused the address. "This is it, son," I answered. My voice was raspy, even to my own ears, after days of silence on the road. I paid him, adding a generous tip of $50 that made his eyes go wide, and stepped onto the crunchy gravel drive. The air here was different. Sweet. It smelled of damp, fallen leaves, and a hint of wood smoke. To lungs accustomed to the biting, frigid oxygen of the North Slope oil camps, this air felt thick, like syrup. The Brooks estate, my gift, my penance. The house stood deep within the grounds, huge and made of old wood, with carved gingerbread trim that looked like lace. I remembered it differently, quiet and abandoned, when I closed the deal 20 years ago. Now, the first-floor windows glowed with golden electric light, and even from the gates, I could hear the buzz of voices and the clinking of glasses. A party. I hadn't announced my arrival. I wanted to see their faces when I walked in. I'd pictured my younger sister, Lala Brooks, throwing her hands up, dropping her knitting, and rushing to embrace me, pressing her soft cheek against mine. I'd imagined my son, Grant, now a grown man, would kiss me solemnly and say, "Mama, you're finally home. Now you can rest." I walked the drive, the gravel crunching beneath my feet, marking the final few yards of my sentence. I carried only a small bag. Everything I'd earned, the millions of dollars that could buy half of this city, was in accounts they knew about, and in assets they were not yet supposed to know about. I was returning not as the Iron Duchess, as the men in the mines had called me, but simply as Mama, as Clementine. The front door was wide open, letting the autumn chill into the warm house. Trendy, rhythmic music, completely out of place against the historic walls, poured from inside. I climbed the steps to the porch. My heart beat steady and calm. I had learned to control my heartbeat. Any sudden surge of emotion could cost lives during a mine collapse. I crossed the threshold. The foyer was flooded with light from enormous chandeliers. The walls, paneled in dark oak, were hung with heavy-framed paintings. I recognized some of them, family heirlooms I had forbidden them to sell. People crowded the center of the hall, men in expensive suits, women in evening gowns, sparkling with diamonds. The air was thick with the scent of costly perfume, roast beef, and hypocrisy. No one noticed me. I stood in the shadow of the doorway, a small gray figure against the backdrop of their dazzling celebration. Then my gaze fell. To the left of the entrance, where the shoe mats usually lay, something shapeless was crumpled. A heap of dirty gray rags that smelled sour. I first thought it was a dog bed someone had forgotten to move, but then the heap moved. A foot appeared from beneath the pile of worn fabric, thin, wrapped in pale skin, with a filthy heel. And then I saw the face. It was obscured by matted silver hair, but I recognized the profile. That slightly hooked nose, that high forehead. Lala, my baby sister, the one I had left as mistress of this estate. She was lying right there on the floor, curled up on the stiff fibers of the welcome mat. She wore a dress that looked like a coarsely resewn curtain, darkened with grime. Something clutched inside my chest, not from pain, but from cold. The kind of cold that precedes a blizzard, when every living thing hides, knowing death is coming. At that moment, a man entered from the garden, laughing loudly, tall and well-built, with a glass of wine in one hand. He wore a wine-colored velvet blazer and tall leather boots caked in thick fall mud. It was Grant, my son. He wasn't looking down, or rather he was looking, but didn't see a person there. He stepped directly toward Lala. I expected him to step over her, perhaps help her up, or yell at the staff for letting his aunt lie on the floor. Instead, he placed the sole of his muddy boot right on her back, between her shoulder blades, which were covered only by rags, and scraped his foot hard, wiping off clumps of clay onto her body. Lala didn't even flinch. She let out a soft, whimpering sound, a sound so familiar and terrible in its obedience. "Grant, my goodness!" giggled a woman holding a champagne flute. "You'll stain the rug!" Grant laughed. The sound was smooth and pleased. "Pay no attention," he announced loudly, for the entire hall to hear, wiping his second boot on my sister's shoulder. "It's just our crazy maid. She loves sleeping on the mat, pretending she's a watchdog. We keep her out of kindness, you know. Family charity." The guests laughed nervously but dutifully. Someone stepped back in distaste. In that moment, the mother in me died. The woman who had sent money transfers for 20 years, who dreamed of hugging her son, who carefully preserved his childhood drawings in a suitcase, she vanished. Her place was taken by the one the grim miners feared above the Arctic Circle. The Iron Duchess had returned. I didn't scream. I didn't rush him with my fists. Hysterics are for the weak. I simply took one step out of the shadows into the light, calmly, deliberately. The noise in the room began to fade. First, the people standing closest to the door fell silent. They didn't just see an old woman in a cheap coat. They saw my eyes, the eyes I used to watch rock collapses and corner cheating foremen. The silence spread through the hall like ice water. Grant, who had his back to me, felt the silence. He slowly turned around. His smug smile was still plastered on his face, but a flicker of confusion already darted in his eyes. But he wasn't the first to react. In the center of the hall, holding a glass of brandy, stood a gray-haired man in a sharp suit, Judge Isaac Peterson, the city's powerful district judge, a man whose career I had once helped save, and the only person here who knew the real me. His eyes widened. His face instantly turned pale, losing all festive color. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the polished floor with a deafening crash. Brandy splattered onto the guests' trousers, but no one moved. Judge Peterson, the man the entire city feared, bent low in a deep, almost servile bow. "Clementine Brooks," he whispered in the deathly quiet. We were told you had passed away." All eyes fixed on me. I stood motionless, looking only at my son. I saw a spasm of fear cross his face, but it was immediately replaced by something else, something slick and calculating. Grant straightened up. He didn't rush to me. He didn't fall to his knees. He burst into a loud, theatrical laugh, pointing a finger at me. "See there," he shouted, gesturing to the stunned guests. "My poor mother really did come back, but look at her. She's staring right through us. The doctors warned me. Her mind is gone, just like that maid on the floor." He stepped toward me, and in his eyes I read a clear sentence. "Don't listen to her ramblings," he snapped to the guests, grabbing my elbow with such force that I felt the fabric of my coat stretch. "She doesn't know where she is." His fingers dug into my arm, but I didn't even wince. The pain was minor, insignificant. I looked directly into Judge Peterson's eyes. The judge stood with his mouth slightly open. His gaze darted between me and my son. In that look, I read a struggle, respect for the past battling the convenient lie of the present. It was easier for him to believe Grant, to believe that the legendary Iron Duchess had lost her mind, than to admit a crime was being committed in this house. Judge Peterson slowly nodded, as if convincing himself, and lowered his eyes. It was silent consent. Betrayal committed out of convenience. "I apologize, ladies and gentlemen." Grant's voice rang with false sympathy. "Family drama, you understand. Old age spares no one." He dragged me across the hall toward the wide staircase leading to the second floor. I walked obediently, offering no resistance, allowing him to play the role of the devoted son leading his frail mother away. My feet trod the thick rugs I had chosen 20 years ago, but now this house seemed alien, like a set in a cheap play. We went upstairs, but Grant didn't lead me to my bedroom, the one that faced the garden. He turned into the narrow servants' corridor to the very end toward a low door whose paint had long peeled away. He shoved the door open with his foot and threw me inside. It wasn't a room, it was a storage closet. A dusty, windowless pantry crammed with old boxes, broken chairs, and the smell of mildew. In the corner stood a narrow cot with a bare, stained mattress. Grant slammed the door shut and leaned his back against it, blocking any retreat. The smile slid off his face like melting wax. All that remained was naked, bestial rage. "Listen to me closely, you old rag," he hissed, leaning down to me. He smelled of expensive wine and rot. "You're dead. To everyone downstairs, you're either dead or crazy. I don't care which one you pick." I remained silent, looking him over. I searched that face for the features of the little boy who used to cry if I scraped my knee, but I saw only a stranger, a weak, greedy stranger. "If you peep," he continued, dropping his voice to a whisper, "if you try to speak to Isaac or anyone else, I'll throw your precious sister out into the snow right now in just her nightgown. And believe me, she'll freeze to death by morning. Do you understand me?" Nothing trembled in my chest. Fear is an emotion, and emotions interfere with planning. I quickly assessed the situation. Physically, I couldn't overpower him. Screaming was useless. The music downstairs would drown it out, and the judge had already made his choice. My only weapons now were time and information. I needed him to relax, to stop seeing me as a threat. I made my hands look weak, let my shoulders slump, and my gaze become unfocused and watery. I began to shake my head slightly, imitating the tremor I had seen in old people back in the mining camp. Grant," I mumbled, intentionally slurring the words. "Where are my glasses? I want to go home. It's dark in here." Grant snorted in disgust. The tension in his shoulders disappeared. He saw what he wanted to see. A broken, senile old woman. "Sit tight," he snapped, "and don't dare come out." He left, and I heard the lock click shut from the outside. I was alone in the darkness, but I didn't lie down on the dirty cot. I stood and listened. I listened to the party continue downstairs, to the glasses clinking in a toast to the host who had just locked his mother in a utility closet. The hours crawled by. Eventually, the music died down, cars drove away, and the house sank into a heavy, silent sleep. I walked to the door. The lock was old and simple. In the mines, I'd had to repair far more complicated mechanisms. I pulled a hairpin from my bun, a simple metal one I always kept for emergencies. 2 quick movements, a quiet click, and the door gave way. I slipped out into the corridor. It was silent, only the old floorboards creaking faintly beneath my feet. I didn't go looking for a comfortable bed. I went downstairs to the hall. It was cold there. A draft snaked across the floor. By the front door, on that same stiff welcome mat, lay Lala. They hadn't even given her a blanket. I walked over to her. She was breathing heavily, wheezing, and twitching in her sleep. I sank to my knees. The coarse fibers of the mat dug into my legs, but I didn't feel the discomfort. I took off my coat and covered my sister with it. Then I sat down beside her, right on the floor, leaning my back against the cold wall. I took her hand in mine. Her palm was icy and rough, like tree bark. "I'm here, Lala," I whispered into the darkness. "I'm back." I didn't sleep all night. I sat, guarding her sleep like a sentry watching the entrance to a mine shaft. I remembered the north. I remembered the cold that made steel crack. This house was colder. The frost here didn't come from the weather. It came from the human heart. But I knew how to melt ice. It just required enough pressure. Dawn arrived with a gray, muddy light. The first person to enter the hall was a maid with a bucket of water. She was young and unfamiliar to me. When she saw us, she gasped and dropped her rag. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. She was followed by an older woman, the head housekeeper. I recognized her. It was Martha. She had worked here before I left. Back then, she was a young, rosy-cheeked girl. Now her face was etched with wrinkles, and her eyes were full of perpetual anxiety. Martha froze, staring at me. I was sitting on the mat in my simple clothes next to the crazy maid. But I lifted my head and looked at her the way I had looked 20 years ago, giving instructions in the kitchen. I didn't say a word of greeting. I simply raised my chin slightly and used my eyes to point to a small table in the corner of the hall. "Tea, here," I said quietly, but firmly. The tone brooked no argument. The young maid snickered, about to say something about crazy people not getting tea. But Martha yanked her sharply by the sleeve. Martha had gone pale, recognizing that tone. "Right away, Mrs. Brooks," she mumbled, and in her voice I heard not fear of Grant, but old ingrained respect. 5 minutes later, she returned with a tray. It held a porcelain teapot, 2 cups, and 2 plates of steaming oatmeal. Martha knelt to place the tray on the floor in front of us. Her hands trembled. She set a cup of tea before me. The saucer clinked. I met her gaze. It was a plea. She quickly, furtively glanced toward the stairs, checking if the master was descending. "Eat up, ladies," she said loudly, for any invisible listeners. "The porridge is fresh, with butter." But as she drew her hand away from my cup, her fingers briefly pressed my wrist, and I felt a small scrap of paper slide beneath the bottom of the cup. Martha quickly stood up and hurried to the kitchen, pulling the young maid behind her without looking back. I waited until their footsteps died away. Lala was starting to wake up, stirring under my coat. I picked up the cup. Beneath it lay a torn piece of notebook paper. I unfolded it. The handwriting was hurried, shaky. "Don't eat the oatmeal. They're putting powder in it. It makes your mind foggy and your legs weak. Only drink tap water." I slowly raised my eyes to the steaming plate of oatmeal. The appetizing smell of butter now seemed like the smell of death. I looked at Lala. She was reaching for the plate. Her eyes were clouded, unfocused. I gently but decisively pulled her hand away. "No, Lala," I said. "We're not hungry today." The war had begun, and the first shot had been fired in the kitchen. I discreetly poured the contents of the bowls into the planter, holding the ficus tree by the door. The earth greedily absorbed the thick, poisoned mass. Lala watched with childlike bewilderment, but didn't object. The habit of obedience was stronger in her than hunger. "Mama, what is this circus you've arranged?" Grant's voice boomed from the stairs. He descended, fastening the cufflinks on his pristine white shirt. Floating behind him was his wife, Paige. She wore a silk robe the color of a faded rose, and a mask of disgusted irritation on her face. "Sleeping in the hall like a dog," she scoffed, giving us a wide berth as if we were contagious. "Grant, I told you she needs to be sent to a clinic immediately. She's frightening the staff." "Quiet, darling." Grant kissed his wife's cheek, but his eyes drilled into me coldly. "Mother is simply eccentric. Old age, you know, takes its toll." They walked into the dining room. I helped Lala stand. Her legs trembled, but she leaned on me with surprising trust. We slowly shuffled in after them. The dining table was groaning with food. A silver platter of sliced meats, fresh fruit, and croissants releasing the aroma of vanilla. Grant and Paige sat at the head of the table. We were pointed toward a small side table in the corner, where a bowl of stale biscuits and a pitcher of water sat. "Have a seat," Grant waved casually, serving himself salmon. "Don't be shy. A special menu for you. Dietary." I sat, maintaining a stone face. Lala immediately reached for a biscuit, gnawing at it greedily with her toothless mouth. I took a piece of the stale bread. It was safe. I ate slowly, watching. My gaze was fixed on my sister. Now, in the daylight, I saw what the dim light of the foyer had hidden. Her pupils were dilated to the maximum, almost obscuring the iris. Her skin was gray and clammy. Her movements were jerky and uncoordinated. This wasn't madness, it was chemistry. Lala suddenly froze with a biscuit in her hand. She stared at a spot on the wall where an antique tapestry depicting a hunt hung. Her lips moved. "The little train that thought it could," she whispered, barely audibly. Grant laughed loudly, sipping his coffee. "Hear that, Paige? That nonsense again. She's been muttering about that little train for 3 years now. A 3-year-old's brain." But I listened. I knew my sister. We had grown up together. And that little train phrase was our favorite saying when we were hiding secrets from our parents. "Chugging up the track saying I think I can," Lala continued, but suddenly changed the words. Her voice became strange, monotonous, as if a robot were speaking. "Second shelf from the bottom, the third book you grab, green spine, page 500. She stopped as suddenly as she'd started and went back to chewing the biscuit. Grant hadn't noticed a thing. He was too busy with himself. He stood up, wiping his lips with a napkin, and walked over to me. He smelled of expensive cologne, which couldn't hide the scent of fear radiating off him in waves. "Mama," he said, the word mama sounding like an insult, "we don't have much time. In 2 days we're having the Founders Ball here. An important investor from New York is coming. I need everything to be perfect." He dropped a folder of documents onto the table in front of me. "This is a formality, permission for your medical care and the management of your remaining accounts. You don't want Paige and me to go broke paying for your medication, do you? Sign here." I looked at the paper. The text was tiny, legally convoluted, but I grasped the essence immediately. This wasn't a power of attorney. This was an act of complete and unconditional gift. Grant handed me an expensive fountain pen. "Come on, don't drag it out. I have things to do." I took the pen. My hand, the very hand that had signed multi-million-dollar coal supply contracts, suddenly began to tremble betrayingly. I pretended to fight the tremor, gripping the pen tightly. I can't see," I mumbled, leaning over the sheet. "Just put an X," Grant barked, losing his patience. I raised the nib over the signature line, and at that moment, my hand jerked convulsively. The pen slammed against the paper, splattering black ink. The blot spread instantly, covering the text with a thick, opaque stain. Then, as if in a panic, trying to fix everything, I ran my hand over the ink, smearing it across the entire sheet, turning the document into black sludge. "Oh," I gasped, feigning fright. "Forgive me, son. My hands, they don't listen." Grant's face turned crimson. The veins on his neck bulged. "You old cow!" he roared, grabbing me by the shoulders and shaking me. "Do you know how much this paper costs? You ruined everything." Paige jumped up, knocking over her chair. "Grant, leave her. She doesn't know what she's doing. You'll kill her before the ball, and we need her alive at least until the signing." Grant shoved me back into the table. He was breathing heavily, clenching his fists. "Get this out of here," he yelled at the servants, pointing at the ruined document. "I'll print a new one, but if you, old witch, twitch again, I'll tie your hands and guide your wrist myself." He stormed out of the dining room, slamming the door so hard that the crystal on the sideboard rattled. Paige ran after him, her heels clicking. Servants rushed to clear the table. I sat, head down, feigning repentance and fear. Martha came over to take the spoiled sheet. "I'll throw it away myself," I said quietly, snatching the ink-soaked wad of paper from under her nose. I want to fix it." Martha looked at me with pity, but didn't argue. When the dining room was empty, I carefully smoothed the sheet on my lap. The ink had dried, but the text was still legible beneath the smudges. I focused on the lines Grant had been so eager to hide under the guise of a medical form. Deed of gift for real property, land parcel, title number, transfer of ownership, immediate and irrevocable. And at the very bottom, in fine print, was an addition that chilled me to the bone. The donor confirms that they are acting in sound mind and memory, and waives the right to reside in the specified property within 24 hours of signing. This wasn't just robbery. It was a death sentence. The moment I signed, Lala and I would be thrown out into the cold, legally and officially, forever. I carefully folded the sheet and hid it in the deep pocket of my old dress. Now I had proof. But proof of what? His greed. That wasn't enough for the judge. I needed to know why the rush, why he needed the house right now when I'd returned with money. I looked at Lala. She was swaying from side to side, whispering again, "Third book, green spine, page 500. The library. The answer was there. I waited until the noise of Grant's car engine faded beyond the gates. He had gone into the city, probably to the notary to prepare new papers. Paige had locked herself in her boudoir, preparing for the ball. The house fell silent, sinking into an anxious, expectant slumber. "Martha," I called quietly when the housekeeper passed by. "Watch Lala. Your head depends on it." Martha nodded. In her eyes, a mixture of fear and resolve flickered. She led my sister away to the kitchen, away from curious eyes. I headed for the library. The dark oak doors were locked. Grant wasn't taking chances, knowing my love for books. I looked around. The corridor was empty. I took out the same hairpin that had served as my key to the closet. My hands remembered the movements. In the mining camp, an old mechanic named Uncle Mike had taught me how to pick the locks on the warehouses when we lost keys in a blizzard. "Feel the metal, Clementine," he used to say. "It's alive. It wants to open. You just have to ask politely." I asked. The click was barely audible, like the snap of a dry twig. The door yielded. I slipped inside and pulled it shut behind me without locking it. The library smelled of dust and old paper. The curtains were drawn, and the room was filled with gloom. I turned on the desk lamp on the massive table. A beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. Second shelf from the bottom. The third book, green spine. I walked to the right shelf. It was the classics section. The third book, green binding, The Little Engine That Could, a children's classic. What a perfect irony. I pulled the book out. It was light, too light for such a thick volume. I opened it. The pages had been cut out, forming a hollow space. Inside lay not a gold ingot or a wad of cash, but a simple school notebook with a plastic cover. I sat on the floor, leaning against the shelf, and opened the notebook. It was Lala's diary. The handwriting at first was neat and copperplate, the kind our governess had taught us. March 15th. Grant sold Mama's silver tea set. Said he broke it accidentally, but I saw the pawnshop receipt. I tried to write to Clementine, but he ripped the letter from my hands. Said Mama was busy with important things and not to worry her with trifles. I leafed through the pages, and with each new date, the handwriting became more ragged, the letters dancing. September 10th. Dr. Hayes came today, gave me a shot, said it was vitamins. But after it, I slept for 2 days. When I woke up, the Winslow Homer painting was gone from the living room. Grant says I gave it to someone. I don't remember. I'm scared. December 2nd. They're giving me new pills. I forget words. I forget the cat's name. "Clementine, where are you? Why aren't you coming home? Grant says you died, but I know it's a lie. I feel you." The last entries were made in pencil, almost illegible scrawls. "There's no money left. He spent it all. He gambled away everything you sent. The house is mortgaged. They want to sell the land. For demolition. A big box store is going up here. Our garden, our apple trees. They'll cut them down." I hid the documents. He won't find them. I sewed them up. The entry broke off. I closed the notebook. My hands were cold, but a fire was raging inside me. Grant wasn't just cruel. He was bankrupt. All the transfers I'd sent over the years, millions of dollars earned with blood and sweat, had vanished. He had blown everything, and now he was ready to destroy the family homestead, to sell the memory of our ancestors to a bulldozer just to cover his debts. He didn't need my remaining accounts. He needed my signature to legalize the sale of the land. Without it, and without Lala's signature, he couldn't do a thing. That's why he was in such a rush. That's why he kept us locked up. He needed to have us declared incompetent to become the sole guardian and executor of the property. Suddenly, footsteps sounded in the corridor, heavy and quick, along with voices. My heart froze. I darted toward the window, hiding behind the heavy velvet curtain. The door burst open. 2 men entered the library. "You don't understand." The voice belonged to Dr. Hayes. It was trembling. "The dosage is already critical. If we increase it, their hearts will stop." "I don't care about their hearts," Grant snarled. "I need them to be vegetables at the ball tomorrow so the judge sees them drooling and signs the guardianship without looking." They stopped right at the desk, just 3 feet from where I was hiding. I could see their silhouettes through a gap in the curtain. Grant paced nervously. "The developer is giving me 1 week," he continued, shouting now. 1 week, Hayes. If I don't bring the title documents for the land, they'll take everything for the debt. And you, my dear friend, they won't spare either. You've been forging prescriptions. You've been writing psychotropics without cause." The doctor sighed heavily, wiping sweat from his brow. "Grant, I'm afraid. Your mother. She doesn't look crazy. That look in her eyes." "She's an old woman," Grant interrupted. "A senile old woman who imagines herself the queen of the mines. Listen to me. Double dose tonight. In their tea, their soup, even if you have to force it down their throats. I need them unable to string 2 words together by morning. Do you understand?" "But that could kill them," Hayes weakly protested. "Then we'll bury them with honors," Grant cut him off. "I need the land, doctor. The land is worth more than 2 crazy old grandmothers. Do as I say. Or I'll tell the judge how your previous patient accidentally died, leaving her condo to your wife." A silence hung in the air, thick and terrifying. I could hear the doctor's ragged breathing. "Fine," he finally choked out. "I'll do it tonight." They left, leaving the door ajar. I stepped out from behind the curtain. My hands no longer trembled. Now I knew everything. The stakes were set. This wasn't just a fight for a house. It was a fight for my life and Lala's, and I had only 1 evening left to beat them. I looked at the diary in my hands. It was a weapon, but I needed more. I needed an ally, and I knew where to find him. Grant himself had given me the clue. Previous patient, condo, wife. I tucked the notebook inside my dress and silently slipped into the corridor. The hunt for the hunter had begun. I knew I had only a few minutes before Dr. Hayes reached the kitchen to prepare the special tea. I didn't run after him. I cut through the staff corridor, knowing the house's layout better than anyone. I intercepted him in the narrow passage by the back entrance. He walked hunched over, clutching a black satchel as if it were filled with rocks. When he saw me, he jumped as if struck by lightning and pressed his back against the wall. "Clementine Brooks," he stammered. You shouldn't be here. You need to be resting in your room." I didn't waste time on politeness. I stepped close, boxing him into the corner. There were no witnesses in this corridor, only the 2 of us and the truth hanging between us like an axe. "Resting, doctor?" My voice was quiet, but it rang with steel. "So I never wake up? Or so I wake up a vegetable convenient for disposal?" Hayes turned pale. Beads of sweat broke out on his forehead. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is for your own good. Treatment." "Stop," I cut him off sharply. "I heard your conversation in the library. I know about the double dose. I know about your late patient's condo that you signed over to your wife." The doctor's eyes widened in horror. He opened his mouth but couldn't utter a sound. "But you don't know one thing, doctor," I continued, looking directly into his pupils. "Do you think I'm just some old lady from the north? I own the controlling interest in the holding company that funds the medical board in the capital, the very board that was reviewing your license revocation case 5 years ago. I didn't intervene then, but I remember your name on the list of undesirable practitioners." It was a bluff, partly. I did wield influence, but I didn't recall the specifics of his case. Fear, however, is a great artist. It fills in the details itself. Hayes trembled. The satchel fell from his grasp and hit the floor with a dull thud. "You have a choice, Hayes." I leaned toward him. You can carry out my son's order, kill us. And then I guarantee that within a week, you'll be sitting in prison, not for malpractice, but for the premeditated murder of 2 people. My lawyers will dig up every mistake, every forged certificate you've made in the last 20 years. You will be ruined. I paused, letting the words sink in. Or you help me now, and perhaps I'll forget your name when I clean up this city. The doctor swallowed convulsively. He looked at me not as a patient, but as a judge raising the gavel for sentencing. What must I do? He whispered. Switch the pills, I commanded. Give us placebos, vitamins, chalk, anything that doesn't kill the mind, and tell Grant that the dose has been administered. He nodded quickly, rapidly, like a bobblehead doll. I'll do it, I swear, I'll do it. And one more thing, I held him by the lapel of his jacket. Tomorrow, at the ball, when they ask about my condition, you will tell the truth. Only the truth. Understand? Yes, Clementine Brooks. I released him. He grabbed his satchel and practically ran toward the kitchen, stumbling over flat ground. I watched him go. I didn't fully trust him, but fear for one's own skin is the most reliable leash. I straightened up, my shoulders squared. I no longer needed to stoop or shuffle my feet. I walked through the corridor of my own home, and with every step, I reclaimed my authority over it. I entered the kitchen. It was in chaos. The cook, a fat, red-faced man Grant had hired, was yelling at Martha, who was trying to feed Lala some soup. "Get that lunatic out of here," he shrieked, waving a ladle. "She'll ruin the guests' appetites with her sight. Let her eat outside." Martha was crying, shielding my sister. Lala was huddled in a ball on the stool. I walked up behind the cook, quietly, unnoticed. "Out," I said. The cook spun around, blinking in surprise. "What? Who are you, old hag? Get back to your kennel." I took a heavy, cast-iron skillet from the counter and calmly weighed it in my hand. I said, "Get out of my house. You're fired. Right now." There was so much cold resolve in my eyes that the cook choked on his own scream. He looked at the skillet, then at me, then at the frozen staff. No one stepped in to defend him. "You're all nuts here," he muttered, tearing off his apron and throwing it on the floor. "My foot won't touch this place again." He ran out the back door. Silence hung in the kitchen. The servants looked at me with reverent horror. "Martha," I said, my voice softer now. "Feed everyone proper food. Lala, too." I walked over to my sister. She raised her eyes to me. The cloudy film was gone. The drugs were beginning to leave her system, and though she was weak, her gaze was clear. "Tina," she whispered, truly recognizing me for the first time in days. "You came?" I hugged her, pressing her thin shoulders tightly to mine. "I came, sweetheart. It's over." Lala suddenly pulled away and looked around conspiratorially. She tugged my sleeve, forcing me to lean close to her ear. "Tina, listen," she whispered quickly, fiercely. "The house. They're looking for the deed." "I know, Lala," I whispered back. "I found the diary." "No, not the diary." She squeezed my hand with unexpected strength. "The document, the real deed itself, the one with the condition. I didn't let him find it. I knew you would come back. I hid it where he would never think to look." "Where?" Lala smiled a weak but cunning smile. "Remember your old coat? The one with the fur collar you wore when you left for the north?" I froze. My old coat, the very one hanging in the utility closet where Grant had locked me. I had spent the night next to it and didn't know salvation was within arm's reach. "You're brilliant, Lala." I kissed her forehead. "You are the smartest one of us all." Now I had everything. The diary with proof of fraud, a doctor ready to testify, and most importantly, the original document that could destroy Grant with a single stroke of the pen. Only one night and one ball remained. Tomorrow they would celebrate victory, and I would orchestrate the funeral of their ambitions. I left Lala in Martha's care and silently went up to the closet. There, in the darkness, among the dusty boxes, hung my old cloth coat, misshapen and faded with time. My fingers trembled as I felt the seam on the lining. There it was, coarse stitches made by my sister's shaking hand. I carefully worked the thread loose with my fingernail. The fabric parted. Inside, cushioned between the padding and the cloth, lay a heavy piece of legal paper, folded into quarters. I pulled it out. The paper crinkled in the silence like a gunshot. Even in the dim light, I recognized the notary seal applied 20 years ago. This was my trump card, my sword. The next day, the house buzzed like a hive. Servants rushed around with trays. Florists decorated the staircase with garlands of fresh flowers. Grant and Paige were on edge. They screamed at everyone who crossed their path, checking every detail. Lala and I were locked in the attic. This was their solution: hide the crazy relatives away until the guests left. But they didn't know the door wasn't locked. Dr. Hayes had kept his word. The lock was open, although a massive padlock hung on the outside, a mere prop he had simply hooked onto the latch without snapping it shut. We sat in silence. Lala was calm. She had taken the medicine Hayes gave her, simple calcium gluconate, and her mind was clear. We could hear the guests beginning to arrive downstairs, music, laughter, the tapping of heels. "It's time," I said when the town hall clock struck 7. I walked over to the old trunk standing in the corner of the attic. I knew my mother's wardrobe was stored there. I lifted the heavy lid. The scent of mothballs and lavender hit my nose. I pulled out a dress, deep burgundy velvet, a severe cut, a high collar. It was old but regal. I put it on. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for me all these years. I brushed my gray hair and swept it into a high bun, securing it with that same hairpin lockpick. Then I pulled a small velvet box from the pocket of the coat I'd worn here. It held a presidential citation for business leadership, a heavy silver medal on a striped ribbon, an honor I'd received in my peak mining years. I pinned it to my chest. I dressed Lala in a simple but clean beige dress I found there. I washed her face and tidied her hair. She no longer looked like a crazy old woman. She looked like a frightened but dignified lady. "Come, Lala," I offered her my hand. "Let's show them who the mistress of this house is." We stepped out of the attic and began to descend the back staircase that led to the main hall. The ball was in full swing downstairs. The enormous chandelier glittered, reflected in the champagne glasses. Grant stood on an improvised stage by the fireplace. He looked magnificent in his tuxedo, radiating confidence and charm. Beside him stood the judge, a heavy-set man with a red face, holding a folder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grant's voice, amplified by a microphone, carried across the room. "Thank you for sharing this evening with us. Today is a special day. We are not only celebrating our family history, but looking toward the future. Unfortunately, my dear mother and aunt cannot be with us. Their health, alas, requires complete rest and isolation." The crowd nodded sympathetically. Paige dabbed her dry eyes with a handkerchief. "It is a heavy burden," Grant continued, adopting a sorrowful expression, "to watch the minds of your loved ones fade. But I, as a loving son, am ready to take responsibility for their well-being and for the management of our family legacy. Your Honor," he turned to the judge, "I ask you to witness this act of guardianship." The judge nodded and opened the folder. Grant took the pen. His face shone with triumph. He could already taste victory. At that moment, we stepped onto the upper landing of the grand staircase. The sound of our steps was swallowed by the music, but they felt our presence on their backs. First, one guest turned, then another. A whisper ran through the room like a wave. The musicians faltered and stopped. Grant lifted his head. The pen froze an inch above the paper. His eyes widened. He didn't see two frail old women in rags. He saw me, straight as a rod, in velvet and with a medal on my chest. And next to me, a clean, calm Lala. The silence became absolute. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock. "Oh, look," Grant tried to laugh, but the sound came out nervous and barking. "They escaped their rooms. Poor, poor women. Security. Where is the security? Get them out of here. They can be violent." He waved a hand at the guards standing by the doors. Two burly men moved toward the staircase. I didn't move. I simply raised my hand, palm forward, a gesture that used to stop mine carts. "Stand still," I said. My voice was not loud, but it resonated through the hall, echoing off the walls. There was such authority in it that the guards froze mid-step. I began to descend slowly, step by step. Lala walked beside me, holding my arm tightly. The guests parted before us, forming an aisle. I saw their faces, surprised, frightened, curious. I found Judge Peterson's gaze. The judge stood in the front row, pale as a sheet. We reached the stage. Grant stepped back as if I were a ghost. "Mama!" he hissed, and the microphone caught the sound, broadcasting it across the room. "What are you doing? Go back to your room!" I reached out and snatched the microphone from his sweaty fingers. "We didn't escape our room, Grant," I said, looking straight into the hall, into the eyes of 100 witnesses. "We escaped your fabrication." I turned to the judge. He was staring at me, mouth agape, still holding the pen above the document declaring me incompetent. "Your Honor," I said clearly and distinctly, "I, Clementine Brooks, am of sound mind and memory, and I am here to report a crime." A gasp went through the hall. Paige shrieked and clutched her heart. "Of theft," I continued, never taking my eyes off my son, "of forgery, and of attempted unlawful restraint." Grant turned deep crimson. His mask was completely shattered. "She's delusional!" he screamed, trying to grab the microphone back, but I stepped away. "Can't you see? This is paranoia. Dr. Hayes, tell them, confirm the diagnosis." All heads turned to the doctor, who was pressed against a column. Grant looked at him with desperate hope. This was his last chance. Hayes slowly stepped forward. His hands were shaking, but he looked at me, then at Grant. There was fear in his eyes, but the fear of me was stronger. "Those records." The doctor's voice wavered, but then grew firm. "The medical charts I provided to the court. They are fake." Grant froze. "What are you talking about?" he shrieked. "I wrote them at Grant Brooks's dictation," Hayes said loudly, looking at the floor. "Under threats. Clementine Brooks and Lala Brooks are perfectly healthy. Their condition was induced artificially with drugs their son forced them to take." An explosion. It was as if a bomb had gone off in the hall. Guests erupted in chatter. Someone screamed. The judge slammed the folder shut with a loud clap. Grant stood alone in the middle of the stage, naked in his lie. His world was collapsing, and then he did the only thing he knew how to do. He chose violence. Grant roared like a wounded animal. There was no calculation or cunning left in his eyes, only the savage fury of a cornered rat. He lunged at me. His fingers were curled, aiming for my throat. He didn't just want to strike. He wanted to silence me forever, to crush the voice that had ruined his illusion of grandeur. "Shut up! Die, you old hag!" he shrieked, leaping off the stage step. I didn't flinch. 20 years in the North taught me that when an avalanche is coming, running is useless. You must face it head on. I merely tightened my grip on Lala's hand. She had cried out and tried to shield me with her body. But the blow never came. A figure in a sharp gray suit rose between my son and me. Judge Isaac Peterson, the prosecutor who had averted his gaze yesterday, now stood like a rock. He intercepted Grant's hand in midair, firmly, professionally. "Don't you dare," he said quietly, but the whisper cut through all the noise in the hall. Grant jerked, trying to break free, but the old judge's grip was iron. "Let go! She's lying! She's crazy!" Grant spat. "I've heard enough," Isaac cut him off, forcefully shoving him back. Grant staggered and fell to his knees right at the judge's feet. "Lay a hand on the woman who built the economy of this city, and you won't live to see the trial. I'll personally make sure of it." At that moment, the hall sprang into action. The security guards, finally realizing where the power lay, seized Grant. He writhed, spewing curses, but his hands were already locked behind his back. Across the room, another movement began. Paige, realizing the ship was sinking, tried to slip unnoticed toward the service exit. She clutched a voluminous handbag that loudly clinked with the family silverware. "Where are you going, ma'am?" Martha blocked her path. Behind her stood the cook, the maid, and the gardener, all the little people of this house who had endured years of humiliation, now looking at their mistress without fear. Paige backed away, dropping the bag. Silver spoons and forks scattered across the parquet floor with a sound like the funeral toll for her ambitions. I walked to the microphone. A deadly silence fell over the hall. Everyone looked at me. The woman in velvet with the medal, who had just survived an attack by her own son and hadn't even adjusted her bun. "Release him," I said. The guards exchanged surprised glances, but loosened their grip. Grant got up, dusting his knees. Hope flickered in his eyes again. He thought I would give up, that a mother's heart would soften. "Mama?" he began, changing his tone to pitiful. "Mama, I'm sorry. I wasn't myself. It was the stress. We'll fix everything." I pulled the folded sheet of legal paper from inside my dress, the one from the coat lining. "You're right, son," I said calmly. "We will fix everything right now." I unfolded the document and showed it to the judge and the judge. "This is the deed to the house and land formalized 20 years ago." My voice was firm. "But you, Grant, never read the fine print. You were too busy spending my money." I walked up close to him. "Section 784 of the State Code." I enunciated every word clearly. "Revocation of gift. A donor has the right to revoke a gift if the recipient attempts to take the donor's life, the life of any member of their family, or causes the donor physical harm." Grant went as white as a corpse. "And," I continued, "if the recipient's treatment of the gifted property, which holds great non-monetary value for the donor, creates a threat of its irreversible loss." I gestured around the room, pointing at the guests, the walls, and the garden outside the window. "This house is the memory of my father, and you turned it into a whorehouse and wanted to sell it for demolition. You starved my sister. You tried to have me declared insane. You raised your hand to me in front of 100 witnesses." I turned to the notary, who was huddled in the corner. "Process the revocation, immediately." Grant truly collapsed to his knees, not theatrically, but from helplessness. His legs wouldn't hold him. "Mama, please, where will I go? I have nothing." I looked down at him. Inside me, there was emptiness. No pity, no malice, just exhaustion. "You had millions, Grant. You had a chance. You had family. You traded everything for smoke and mirrors." I nodded to Judge Peterson. "Take them both. I am filing charges of fraud, grand larceny, and attempted murder." Police officers, summoned by one of the guests, were already entering the hall. They took Grant by the arms. He didn't resist. He hung on them like a rag doll, looking at me with empty, glazed eyes. Paige was led out behind him. She was sobbing, smearing mascara across her face. The guests stood frozen. They didn't know how to react. Applaud, leave, apologize. A tall official, the important investor the ball was thrown for, approached me. He looked embarrassed. "Clementine Brooks," he began, extending his hand. "We didn't know. We were told. Allow me to express my admiration." I didn't take his hand. I just looked at him and at everyone else. At those who had laughed at the crazy maid on the mat yesterday, at those who had drunk wine bought with my family's stolen money. "Get out," I said quietly. The official flinched. "Excuse me?" "Get out of my house," I repeated louder. "The ball is over." No one dared to argue. The guests drifted toward the exit, silent, heads down, like schoolchildren reprimanded by the principal. 10 minutes later, the hall was empty. Only Lala and I remained, along with Martha and Judge Peterson and Dr. Hayes, who was sitting on a chair, covering his face with his hands. I walked over to the doctor. He jumped. I'm ready to face punishment," he whispered. "You'll treat people," I said, "for free, at the city clinic, in the homeless division, for 5 years. If I find out you've taken a single dime or refused anyone, I'll have you jailed." Hayes looked up at me, his eyes full of tears, and nodded. It was better than prison. It was a chance for atonement. Judge Peterson approached me. He took my hand and kissed it. old-fashioned and respectful. "Forgive me, Clementine," he said. "I'm an old fool. I let my judgment cloud." "You corrected yourself, Isaac." I smiled weakly. "Thank you for your help." When everyone was gone, Lala and I remained in the vast, empty hall. Confetti and silver spoons were scattered on the floor, but the air felt clean. I looked at my sister. She stood by the window, gazing into the dark garden. "They're gone, Lala?" I asked. She turned around. Her face was lit by a quiet, peaceful smile. "Yes, Tina. All the demons are gone." I walked to the door and flung it wide open. The cold night wind rushed into the house, blowing out the remnants of expensive perfume and fear. I picked up the dirty mat where my sister had slept, rolled it up, and threw it forcefully out the door into the darkness. "No more mats," I said. "We'll buy a new one tomorrow, and a new life." A week later, the house still smelled of fresh paint and newly cut wood, a scent I preferred to any French perfume. Martha, the gardener, and I had scrubbed every corner. I ordered all the furniture from Grant and Page's bedroom to be burned in the yard. The fire consumed the velvet headboard and silk canopies, carrying away the memory of the years of humiliation with the smoke. Now I sat in the garden on a low bench, plunging my hands into the loose, cold earth. I was planting tulips. The bulbs settled in the holes like small promises of a future spring. The dirt under my nails reminded me of the north. But there, the earth was an enemy. Here, it was a mother. "Tina, the tea is ready." I turned around. On the veranda, wrapped in a warm sheep's wool blanket, sat Lala. A steaming kettle sat on the table beside her. She held a delicate porcelain cup from the very set we thought had been sold, but which Martha, smart woman, had hidden in the cellar 5 years ago. Lala no longer trembled. Her gaze was clear and calm, though a shadow of the horror she'd endured still lingered deep in her eyes. But with each passing day, that shadow grew fainter. I brushed the dirt from my hands and walked to the veranda. The sun, breaking through the yellowing leaves of the old maples, painted fanciful patterns on the floor. "How do you feel?" I asked, sitting down in the rocking chair next to her. "Good," my sister smiled. "For the first time in a long time. Just quiet. You know, Tina, I've been thinking, the East Wing, it's empty." I raised an eyebrow questioningly, sipping the hot thyme tea. "It has 5 rooms," she continued, gazing somewhere over the trees. "Bright and spacious. Isaac Peterson said there are many people in the city like I was. Old women whose children drive them out of their homes, who are considered burdens. They have nowhere to go." I set my cup down. The thought had already been circling in my mind, but I was afraid to voice it, thinking my sister needed peace. "A crisis center?" I asked. "A home," she corrected softly. "Just a home where no one will sleep on a mat, where you can drink tea from pretty cups and not be afraid of being poisoned." We'll do it," I said firmly. "I still have contacts at the foundation. And the money? Well, Grant spent a lot, but the North Slope knows how to be generous to those who know how to wait. We will restore everything. We will help." A car horn signaled in the distance. The sound of an engine grew louder. Gravel crunched under tires. A small delivery truck pulled up to the gates. "Did you order something?" Lala wondered. "I did," I squinted slyly. "A gift for both of us, the most important piece of interior decor." I went to meet the courier. The young man unloaded a heavy, thick bundle. I signed the delivery slip and carried the load back to the porch. "Unwrap it," I nodded to my sister. Lala pulled back the brown paper. Beneath it was a new doormat, thick coir with a stiff pile that wouldn't flatten for another 100 years. But the material wasn't the main thing. The main thing was the inscription, burned in black letters across the center. Lala began to read it aloud, and her voice cracked with laughter. "Wipe your feet or face the matriarch." We looked at each other and burst out laughing. The laughter, clean and ringing, flew to the tops of the old linden trees, scattering the crows. There was no bitterness in that laughter, only freedom. I placed the mat by the door. It lay perfectly, covering the spot where the old rags had recently rested. "There," I said, straightening up and looking at the renewed facade of our house. "Now it's right. Welcome home, Clementine. Welcome home, Lala." We stepped inside, leaving the door open so the autumn wind could freely sweep through the corridors, clearing away the last shadows of the past. Life was just beginning. I'm really glad you're here and that I could share my story with you. If you liked it, show me by liking the video and subscribing to my channel. Let's see how many of us there are. Write in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is. I'm so curious to know where all you wonderful people are tuning in from. If you want to support me a little extra, you can also send a small donation. I share new life stories for you every single day. And now, 2 of my most popular stories will pop up on the screen, so you can choose what to watch next.